especially since the draft is still being created and we're still going to be kind of shopping around the draft and really getting more suggestions from folks. So it's important to know that we're still at the beginnings of the process, and so some of these deeper questions we might not have specific answers for yet. So does elected and appointed members of a political party central committee mean county central committee? I would think that if you're a part of the party central committee, so there's two separate ones is what you're saying. I think that would be if you are appointed or elected to a central committee or county central committee for a party, then I think it would count as the 5 years. So within the last 5 years.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So you're taking all voters.
That's basically the entire Douglas County Democrat population.
Well, it would only be if you are like a part of the leadership, if you're appointed as the leadership of that party. So
That's too vague.
Well, is it very precinct committee person or is it officer within our
Yeah, that's.
Well, that's something for them.
Because you only got 17 of them,
Mm-hmm.
and they all have a membership level. So.
okay.
Did you have a clarification over here?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you in the back.
The length of time accommodation is small population. See, I'm doing it in Sacramento County, we're 1.6 million people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I can take this into consideration, and I will, because Norman actually is the one who's been talking with legislators and the one who's been with the draft, and so I actually don't know for 100% whether this would be a thing. So why don't I go ahead and talk to him, and then I'll get back to Jenny, and then they can send something out for this. You can also email me this question, and I can get back to you as well about this one.
Can you explain who Norman is?
Yeah, so
When you're talking about that question and trying to get an answer, there's also the consideration that in more rural counties or spread out counties like ours, we don't even have enough Democrats to elect to each precinct committee person position.
Right.
So most of the Democrats that are active are precinct committee people.
okay.
So I want to say something.
Okay, you can say something, yeah.
So I wanted to speak to that point too. I think that the clarification needs to come between party officers and states and central committee delegates and precinct committee people. These are all very different levels of participation, and I don't know that this is actually clarified in the proposal so far, and that's one of the reasons we're having this. Lupe?
Vicki, perhaps one of the ways to differentiate it is if it was a paid position versus like, I'm part of the 4th CD, okay? It's totally volunteer. I don't get paid for any of the time I spend on the road doing this, that, and the other.
I saw your question, and I think the point for that isn't whether the person is paid or not. For instance, if they were, say, a state party officer and they said, I really want to be on the commission, if I waive getting a salary as a commissioner, as a redistricting commissioner, then can I participate? I think that the overriding interest isn't so much whether the person is paid or not, or waives having a salary, as it is not having partisan or partisan participation and balancing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we saw that question. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. So the next question. So yeah, I think that's a good point, and I will go in. I'll make sure to mention Norman. Norman's the president, by the way, and this was the only forum he couldn't attend. So of the League of Women Voters of Oregon, and so I will mention that that this is specific. This first question, that this is something specific that we need to actually clarify a little more in the draft. So the next question that we had was, do you have a suggestion for the extent of gerrymandering in individual counties? Is that, that's what it says.
We talked about this with special
Yeah, And so we can see how gerrymandering has affected congressional and state legislative districts, but when it comes to local or communities of interest being drawn, that really varies, and I don't have a specific example of how that's done. But this isn't redistricting. Really, just focuses on the state and the congressional districts, and not special districts or those other districts that you find in counties. Yeah.
I see your question. Hang on just a second. When we look at the information that we put online for voter service, we look at putting all of these special districts, and we have almost 1,000 of them in Oregon, into our Vote 411, so that when people look up their address, they can see who their candidates are. And I wish I could show you all what some of our fire districts look like, especially down here in Douglas County. If you look on the map, you can see the road going, and it's squirreling, so you know there's altitude involved, and you can see this little piece of property and this little piece of property, and these are not contiguous districts. They're not connected to each other. They have little individual plots that look like this is somebody's ranch. And they're not connected to each other. And when you look at the concept of gerrymandering for a special district, it goes kind of wonky, and that's one of the reasons.
What I'm interested there, and I think a lot of us are who work politically, is if you look at Douglas County alone, we're divided into 5 congressional districts, and Roseburg is divided into 3. So I've worked on 4
Not
different
congressional.
campaigns.
State legislative, not
Okay.
congressional.
Do you understand?
That's I think that's
Well, state
a good
legislative,
clarification.
sorry.
Yeah.
Let's use the wrong term.
Okay.
And so it's impossible for Roseburg even to, vote as a unit, let alone.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a good point, and that's when communities of interest really can become a factor in district lines, right? Because you have a city like Roseburg that might be being drawn into completely 3 different state representative districts, even though they identify as a whole community with similar voting patterns. And so that's a really good example of how we might see gerrymandering here in Oregon, is when clear communities of where clear communities of interest are being split into different districts.
My question was about it. It's not real apparent unless you look at the districts based on counties.
Mm-hmm.
And once you do that, then you can begin to see how the districts are so cut up in order to favor one area over another.
Yeah, and that's a good comment. I think that's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons why we're really addressing this as an issue, I think. Yes?
So what you guys are basically working is at the federal and the state level, but not necessarily at the city and, okay. Who would be in charge, like Lillian says, the city of Roseburg, and the county, and I'm on the fire board, okay? And we're trying to solve that issue, but we can't. Because the commissioners refuse to do anything about it, because I think they're the ones that set it up. And then the city can also annex those areas that are under the fire department right now and take it over. Yeah, but it's still gerrymandering that is done by the county for the fire district.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question because it's a different issue. It's still a good, I think it's an issue for sure. But we're really just focusing on state and federal because those are the districts that get redrawn by the legislature during the redistricting session. And so I think that's a good concern. I could share that question that you wrote down for Norman, and he can get back to you if he knows anything more than what I do. But I don't have an answer for that just because I didn't look into that deep. So I'll just be honest about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I did get a couple of census questions, so I wanted to clarify some of the census stuff. So one person asked who's in control of the census, and so it's a federal bureau that actually is in charge of the census process. And what they do is they send surveys out. So that's how you get involved in the census, is by filling out the survey when you receive a survey. The next question was about why is it so heavily debated to have a citizenship question on the census. And the reason for that is a lot of people don't know this, but everyone gets counted in the census, including citizens and non-citizens. And if there's a citizenship question on the census, pretty much all non-citizens are not going to want to fill it out because of fear of being deported. And that's a problem because we need to know how many people are in our counties and that we're funding for and that are being represented, right? And so it is a heavily debated question because of that reason. For one, we want people to fill out the census. We want to know how many people are there. And we also want to know how many undocumented citizens we have and that are supporting our communities and are a part of our communities. But we know that if we add that question in there, it could actually discourage those people from filling out the census.
Who proposes these questions? Who agrees on them? Who submits them? I mean, is this a legislative body or?
This is the Federal Census Bureau is the one who makes the census and the questions for the census.
Are they controlled? Are they an independent body? Are they controlled by the House or Senate? Or
Yeah, who's the guy that runs that?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not actually a part of the legislature. It's a part of it's an actual bureau in the federal government. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So the next question was about the 5th Congressional District and what that might look like. That's really up in the air yet. It's really going to be 6, sorry, yes. Because the population, it's actually been the past 2 decades that Oregon was like, oh, maybe we'll get it, and we didn't. Oh, maybe we'll get it, and we didn't. So we're really thinking we might get one this time because our population's been increasing so much. And it could completely change the way our districts are drawn. One example of how it might affect Oregon is Congressional District 2 is very, very large right now, and if we had a 6th congressional district, that one would probably shrink and not be as large and all-encompassing of more than half of our state, right? And so that's an example of how that might, a 6th congressional district might change the way our districts look. But we really don't know yet because we don't have the census data. So the next question was if a duly elected member or volunteer can be a member of the commission, and I think we answered that. It's not necessarily about pay. All right. Can the time limit to accomplish a map prior to approval, can it be extended or until one is accepted? So yes. There is actual more, I didn't actually read the whole draft to you all, but there is exceptions. Say maybe there's snow and they can't get to the 2nd congressional district or something like that. There are some exceptions and some timeline changes that can happen to make sure that as much of the public as possible can be informed before a map is passed. So how can you participate? I did that one. So the rules for selecting a commissioner, there are a lot of them, and they would almost rule out everyone. So I think that's a good comment. There are a lot of people here in Oregon that aren't a part of a political party and deeply involved in the political parties here in Oregon, who are just going about their daily lives doing other things. And again, we want to try and keep people who are really entrenched in the party system here in Oregon, who are being nominated and elected and are part of our politics. They're the ones who have that clear conflict of interest, right? Because they can say, well, I work for the Democratic Party, so I want more Democratic representation here in Oregon. So I think I want to draw districts this way, because I know where the voters are, because I'm the one knocking on doors, and I'm the one who knows, right? And so they have this voting data that you're not supposed to use, but they use it because they just know it, right? It's hard to just like block off one part of our brain. So I think that's what we're really trying to get at is citizens who aren't as deeply entrenched in our party, in the party parties. Yes.
Not to take away from anybody, but you say to find somebody that's not entrenched so that maybe they're not so politically skewed one side or the other. What guarantees, or does it mean that the person needs to have some kind of political savviness in general, because, I mean, you've gotta have somebody that's got to know something
Yeah.
somewhere along the line. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
I know I understand that, but it's something that if we can present, then it's something that you think about too. Because the NABs, they're the largest party now.
That's a good question. So how would we actually qualify? How would we actually screen qualified candidates? Yeah. So I'm, and this is just an assumption, but we're pretty sure that more than 60 people are gonna apply to be a commissioner, and that's what the pools would narrow down to. So they're gonna look at like who has degrees or who has some experience and actually knows this issue, right? It's gonna be like applying for a job. It's gonna be who's qualified, who has knowledge of this area, and they are required to actually be registered to largest or second largest or non-affiliated, and that's the reason why we say multi-partisan and not non-partisan, is because we're human beings. We all have biases, we all have leanings, political leanings, and we're not going to be able to just become robots all of a sudden.
You got one with political leanings back there, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
So I really think that you should let local candidates who haven't actually gotten office apply. I've heard you say that if you ran for office at all, and even if you lost, you can't do this.
I think that means on a state or national level, I'm not sure.
Does it mean county?
Yeah. And in some cases, candidates, it's only state and congressional if it's down to some of those more local. But the other thing is it's within the last 5 years too. So someone who ran twice and then stopped running could then decide to go another route and apply for the commission instead. If, for instance, it was 5 years ago when the last time they ran. And that's why they have that there as well.
And going on that, so in the last 5 years, you were just saying that the population of Oregon is like tripling here, so lots of people haven't even lived here 5 years, and so I'm just gonna say, like, okay, I ran for office, I moved here 3 years ago, I didn't win, so now I can't even be a part of this.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
No, we're not sure if the elected officials applies to every single elected official or only ones elected on a state level or a national level. We're not sure if it applies to us.
Is this being used anywhere else?
Yeah, so all of the screening criteria, pretty much a lot of the screening criteria comes from the California model. And
Yeah, and they have so many.
they do have a lot more people.
You do some good things.
90% of the minority population.
California is so one-sided. I mean, you can't look at that legislature and say, oh, look how fair that is.
What's your question?
It just seems that with all of the restrictions that you have, you're ruling out pretty much everybody that is politically engaged.
Or knowledgeable.
How can you have a commission whose business is political without having people that are politically engaged? It just seems like it's crazy.
Executive directors of nonprofits, they're really good at policy making and all that kind of stuff, and usually not involved in politics because they're not involved in
You're looking for people that don't wake up in the morning and think.
And for instance, you all here, some of you all are league members, some of you aren't. You all are a part of a politically engaged, non-partisan nonprofit and would be very qualified commission members because of that. And so that's another example of someone who's very politically engaged who would be a great candidate for a commission. Yeah, but that's a great question.
I think it's a problem that your restrictions are too restrictive.
For the state.
For this state.
I agree.
And I think you should rethink that.
Okay.
That's why there's gonna be 10 hearings around the state, limits, so.
Nobody's gonna listen.
There could be a requirement where you actually had to have moved here in the last 3 years, that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, so the requirement,
Would love that.
the first requirement is that you're registered to vote in Oregon for the last 2 years. So you need to be registered in Oregon for 2 years, and that way you get someone who's at least been politically active for a little while in Oregon.
There's a lot of people that are registered to vote that aren't even aware they are.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
That is true. Yeah. Okay, so the next question, let me see here. I think we just did that one. Okay. So the next question that we had was that the Oregon GOP is starting to gather signatures for the 2020 ballot measure initiative to give county commissioners dominance over statewide redistricting instead of the legislature or government, and the Secretary of State as backup. How does this work, and do I know anything about it? So there was, so the Secretary of State currently, he actually created a task force, and the task force did have a draft that was similar to ours but had a couple of differences. One of their suggestions was to have county commissioners more involved in the process and have them actually make suggestions. That's not currently in our draft. Yeah, that's not currently in our draft as of right now. We don't have county commissioners as decision makers in that process.
An opposing, right? The Grand Old Party can come up with their own petition.
Yeah, so I think that's what this is saying, is that there is currently a petition for a different system. I know that county commissioners, and specifically the Republican Party right now, are the ones that are very passionate about changing our redistricting process. But the reason why we're going towards a nonpartisan or a multi-partisan independent commission and not this kind of reform is because we believe this is a process issue, not a party issue. Across the United States and even in Oregon, there have been examples of both parties being guilty of gerrymandering. And making the process fair will be better for both parties and will be better for voters. Because what if the Republican Party suddenly gets control of the legislature here in Oregon, and then the Democrats are suddenly on the lose end? It goes back and forth, and so it's really it really behooves both parties to want a more fair process, because they could be on the short end of the stick.
What type of commission have the Republicans?
So the Republicans, as of right now, the Republicans are more in favor of an independent commission than Democrats are. And the reason for that is because currently we do have a Democratic supermajority and a Democratic governor. So if a draft of a map was passed, it's very likely that it could be gerrymandered to support Democrats because there wouldn't be very much of a process to veto that. And so that's what we're seeing right now as the supporting parties, I guess you could say. But like we're saying, we really truly believe this is a process issue and that both parties should be on board with this. But that's a great question.
So I noticed that you said both parties. I mean, don't you have
And the other parties. Thank you for making me more inclusive. Yes, I'm all parties. Yes. Yeah, because actually I believe that the Independent Party is actually another major party here in Oregon. So it's important to
Let's see if it persists after this.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if it persisted or not. What's that question back there?
Another concern I have is even within parties,
Mhm.
there's groups that kind of get left out. And so that's one of the other things I'm concerned about, when you have it being just the two major parties,
Mhm.
that there's easily, you have more than 50% of people's needs kind of accidentally
Yeah.
left out because of who dominates and speaking up and
Mhm.
who's in the background.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're going to have 5 members of the commission not be a part of the Democrat and Republican Party, to really try and get voices from all different kinds of voters here in Oregon, people who are unaffiliated with a party, people who are in the independent, people who are in the Pacific Green or the working families. We want to make sure that we have all parties and ideas here in Oregon. They have a say in how districts get drawn. So, yeah.
So the way the map's currently drawn,
Mhm.
it benefits the Democrats more currently?
I would say currently the process could benefit Democrats more.
So each time that the Secretary of State draws this map, how different can it be if that's what they come up with every time? I know it's probably pretty generalized, but how much different could it be if that's what they're sticking to every time? It doesn't seem like there's room to change it that much.
So the
census would change that once it comes out, but
just to clarify, the legislature is the first people who have control, and it's only if the legislature cannot pass a map in time does the legislative maps get kicked to the Secretary of State, who then has to have their maps approved by the Oregon Supreme Court. And so it's not originally the Secretary of State who ends up drawing the maps, but a lot of times in Oregon they end up drawing the map, which we believe isn't really a good backup to the legislature, because that's just one person who has a party affiliation making this decision. And so that's how you might see districts changing, and that's also why there's usually a lot of challenges to the Secretary of State's maps, because they're just one person making decisions, and they're going to have political leanings for the way that they draw their districts. Yeah.
So, since we have such a problem with rural urban in this state, how are you going to be fair about that?
So how are we going to be fair about rural urban commissioners?
No, the
Divide.
political,
Okay.
the representation from rural
Mhm.
versus urban.
Yeah. So I know that currently the way districts are drawn is, and at least for congressional districts, is based on population. So that's the reason why District 2 is so big, is because there's just not as many people that live there compared to over the mountains. And so the way that we see it is, if we get districts drawn by non-legislatures and have more people besides just the Democrats and the Republicans in charge of how lines get drawn, we'll be able to have more voices from Oregon actually at the table, right? We'll have independent rural Oregonians, or someone from the Pacific Green Party who usually here in Oregon never gets to win an election, but might have a say and represent a lot of people in this committee in how districts are being drawn, and have maybe more knowledge of communities of interest from their party, right? And so that's an example of how I think it could make our process more fair and representative of Oregonians from rural communities and urban communities.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you. As you all are leaving, please make sure you grab a brochure, because it actually has a recap of everything we talked about today and my contact information.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I don't want to chase them down, but maybe you could. I don't know. Okay, so this question is a really good question. I unfortunately do not have the answer to any of it, but I will read it. So what funds will pay for these commissioners? How will their funding be monitored? What tax status will they receive from the IRS? Will they be able to receive donations? Will they have bylaws, and who will write them? And will these commissioners have staff? That is all questions that would be, I think, answered as we get closer and closer to the draft actually becoming an initiative. As of right now, I don't have the whole thing memorized in my head with those details, because they're still really up in the air. I do know that the funds for the commissioner, I think, would come out of the Secretary of State's office, from what I can remember, but I am not 100% sure. I do know that the legislature every 2 years would vote on that budget. And so they would in 2000, and in the years that end in 9, they would vote on what amount of money they would allot to the commissioners in order to run. Yes.
So whoever's on this commission, they would be on it for, I think you mentioned 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so would this be like a full-time job, 40 hours a week type situation, or is it just gonna be a part-time, seasonal type of thing?
I think it would be depending on what time in the process it is. I think it would be definitely a full-time job closer to the redistricting session. But in the off years, it probably is not going to be a full-time job. And so I think it would be similar to how legislators, they're in the office and then they're not in the office. And so in that way, I think during the actual redistricting process, which would take, I think, an entire year to go through the entire process of going across the state and getting those public hearings and getting those maps drawn and waiting for petitions to be circulated, challenges through the courts, addressing those challenges, redrawing the maps. That's going to take a while. So you'll at least expect to see the commissioners working full time for at least a year, I would say, out of that 10.
How can someone apply for that?
They would probably apply through the Secretary of State would be the one who has that application, because the Secretary of State would be the one who selects the retired judges and draws the names randomly. So it'd probably be on that section of the state website. There would be, yes. Yes.
So for 10 years, people get appointed at the beginning, 10 years, people move, they change their party affiliation, they get sick, they die, what would be the process for replacing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that there is a process for screening commissioners in and out in case of some of those situations. And in that case, I think they would go back to the pool and randomly draw some more people to fill in those vacancies.
I think we should probably be
Wrap it up.
available for any further questions,
Mhm.
but thank you to Kendallin for coming, and thank you for all of you.
Thank you so much for your questions.
Good questions.